Hello, I'm Ollie and this is CriminOlly, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today I've got 10 great works of horror for you from 10 different decades. So today I've got 10 really fantastic shorter works of horror for you, one from each of the last 10 decades. And this is designed kind of to tie in with the Horror Mayhem event which takes place next month in May. So the theme of Horror Mayhem this year is Decades of Dread. The idea being that you read books from different decades and those books should be shorter works of horror. So yeah, I've got 10 books for you. I've actually got slightly more than 10, but roughly 10 books for you from over the last 10 decades, so starting in the 1930s. And these are all either like short novels or novellas or short stories. So the first one then from the 1930s, this is, I guess you'd call it a short novel by H.P. Lovecraft. One of the first things I read by Lovecraft, in fact. It's At the Mountains of Madness, which is about an Antarctic expedition. And because it's Lovecraft, you know that expedition is going to come up against some weird stuff. Lovecraft tends to get labelled as a horror writer, and he definitely is a horror writer, but he's also kind of a fantasy writer, kind of a science fiction writer, and At the Mountains of Madness really combines those different things. So it has his fantastic trademark imagination, has some very unsettling and weird stuff in it, but also has, kind of a more standard adventure-y type story about this expedition. So really interesting stuff. Lovecraft is, in many ways, and is often considered to be, the godfather of modern horror. And he's a really interesting writer to read. Definitely, try one of his short stories if you don't fancy something as long as this. He was writing really through kind of the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s. So this is towards the end of his career, but a very interesting and enjoyable book. Moving on to the 1940s then. So a story which is incredibly well known, certainly doesn't need me to recommend it, but I think it's a story that's much better known in the US than it is in the UK. I believe it's often taught in high school in the US. It certainly isn't taught at school, I don't believe, in the UK, but it really is fantastic and is absolutely horrific as well. That story is The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. Now, I love Shirley Jackson's short fiction generally. I think The Lottery is, probably the best of her short stories, but I've always enjoyed her short stories. So if you pick up a Shirley Jackson short story collection, you will definitely have a good time. Now, some of her stuff you could almost call crime. Some of it was more like kind of mystery fiction rather than horror fiction, but all of it has that kind of wonderful ambiguity and subtlety that a lot of her work has. So definitely recommend Shirley Jackson. I think she's really, really great. Moving on then to the 1950s, a short novel that came out right at the end of the 1950s, best known because of the movie adaptation of it. It is Psycho by Robert Bloch. So this is, I think, in some ways more of a horror novel than the movie is a horror movie. I think of the movie of Psycho as being kind of more of a suspense movie in some ways. It's got that very long, very slow build-up. It's only kind of halfway through that you actually get into what you think of looking back on it as being Psycho the movie, Norman Bates with the knife in the shower. But the book is really interesting in that it gives you a lot more insight into the inner workings of Norman Bates's mind. It's very short, it's a very quick read, but definitely highly recommended, particularly if you're a fan of the film. I think it makes a really interesting accompaniment to the film. Moving on to the 60s then, a book I have talked about on the channel before, but a really great one. It's The Case Against Satan by Ray Russell. So this is a book that is in many ways very similar to The Exorcist that came out a decade later in the 1970s. But I think this is a much more subtle and interesting book than The Exorcist. The Exorcist is great, but let's be honest, it's not, you wouldn't call that book subtle. The Case Against Satan is much more subtle, but very similar in terms of theme. So about a teenage girl who is apparently possessed and some Catholic priests who try and exorcise the evil spirits from within her. What's really interesting about this book is, though, you really don't know if she's actually possessed or not. It's very, very subtly done. It has that same kind of examination of the Catholic faith and the the inner thoughts of the priest that The Exorcist has, but all done with much more subtlety. It's really, really great and very, very unsettling too. Moving on to the 1970s then, and another story that is probably better known for the movie that was based on it. That movie was Steven Spielberg's debut, Duel, which came out in the early 70s as a TV movie, and is based on I'm not sure if it's a short story or a novella. I think it's a short story by Richard Matheson. So Richard Matheson, a fantastic writer of short stories, kind of suspense, horror, science fiction. He was a big contributor to the TV show The Twilight Zone, so that gives you a sense of the kind of feel of his books. So Duel is about a guy who's driving across America and ends up getting into basically a disagreement with a guy driving a juggernaut. And the book is just this kind of cat and mouse story of the battle between them as they're driving along the road. Absolutely fantastic, really, really gripping, really suspenseful. Has the kind of trademark suspense you would expect from something that has Spielberg's name attached to it. So really, really recommend the story and all of Richard Matheson's work. He's really, really great, but Duel is one that came out in the 70s. Some more short stories now. So from the 1980s, what I still consider to be really one of the towering achievements of short story writing in modern horror, or is the 1980s still modernish horror? It's modern to me anyway. It's The Books of Blood by Clive Barker. So a 6-volume set of short stories, very graphic at times. Barker just has a wonderful imagination, a wonderful prose style. Some of these stories are kind of beautifully fantastic. Some of them are downright horrific. Some of them are kind of subtly unsettling. Many of them are very, very graphic. He's a really, really interesting writer, and this is a fantastic set of short stories. So pick up any one of these volumes. They're all great. I think nowadays they tend to be packaged as two volumes, with volumes 1 to 3 in one and 4 to 6 in the other. But I can't recommend them highly enough. Or if you fancy a novella from Clive Barker, you can read another book better known for its film. That's his novella, The Hellbound Heart, which he filmed as Hellraiser. So another really, really great work of horror. Very rich, very imaginative, very graphic, absolutely fantastic. Right, moving on then to the 1990s. So I've actually got 2 novels for you here. One of them is definitely what you would call a short novel. It's just over 200 pages. The other one is just over 300 pages, but it's an incredibly quick read. So let me start with that one. These 2 books, both definitely horror novels. Both horror novels I really, really like, but they could not be more different from each other. So the first one, the one that's just over 300 pages, is Deadhead by Shaun Hutson. So Shaun Hutson is a British horror writer who you don't really hear talked about that much. He's a favourite writer of mine. I was a huge fan of his stuff as a teenager, growing up through the 1980s. He is unashamedly trashy. So he wrote very quickly a series of very exploitative, nasty, over-the-top horror novels. His debut under his own name, Shaun Hutson, was The Slugs, which, as the title suggests, is about killer slugs. He is famous for claiming that he wrote some of his books in a weekend, and you can definitely believe that. There is not a lot of depth in Shaun Hutson's books, but he does have a wonderfully horrific imagination. And Deadhead, which is a later book from him coming out in the 90s, is incredibly grim and graphic. He gravitated more towards, or has gravitated, he's still writing more towards kind of crime style horror, if you like, so serial killer type books and that kind of thing. And Deadhead is about snuff movies, and it is really, really horrible, but it will stick with you. It's really gritty, really grimy, but very, very readable. The other book from the 90s then, completely different, but I wanted to talk about it because there's a new edition coming out of this book soon. So the book is Tim Lucas's Throat Sprockets. So this is a very subtle book, completely different from Deadhead, about a guy who, in a weird kind of rundown porn movie theatre, sees this film, which basically fetishizes women's throats, and it feels like it's like porn for vampires, basically. And it's about him investigating that film, trying to figure out who made it. I love books rather, about kind of lost movies, weird movies, and this definitely delivers. It was originally a comic strip which was published in an American independent horror comic called Taboo, and then Tim Lucas turned it into a novel. So it's long been out of print, but Valancourt Books are about to issue a new edition of it, apparently. So if you like the sound of it, do look out for that new edition, because the kind of older copies of it tend to go for quite a lot of money now. Right, moving on to the 2000s then. So a short horror novel that I read only quite recently, another one about cursed movies. So this is The Witnesses Are Gone by Joel Lane. So this is about a guy who, in his house, discovers, like a house he's recently moved into, discovers this cardboard box with a load of crap in it from the previous owners, including some videotapes that have this weird, unsettling film on them. And it's about him trying to find out more about that film. That's like probably my favourite trope in horror fiction. And Joel Lane does it beautifully. It's a really subtle book, really, really unsettling. I have some short story collections by Joel Lane as well, which I'm probably going to be reading myself for Horror Mayhem. But I just think this is a fantastic book. It goes all over the place. It's quite hypnotic and kind of dreamlike at times. But yeah, really, really fantastic. Okay, moving on to the 2010s then. And another short horror novel which has that same kind of weird, surreal, dreamlike vibe to it that the Joel Lane book has. And that's Fever Dream by Samanta Schweblin. So this is a book about a virus is sweeping the world, and it's basically set in a hospital room. And it's about like a mother and son who are in this hospital room as all the weirdness goes on around them. And it's just mesmerising. It's really gripping. You can't stop reading it, but it's really just unsettling and weird as you go through it. You never really get a handle on exactly what's going on, but it manages to be fantastically effective despite that. Really, another really, really good short horror novel. And then finally, we have from the 2020s a novella, Rest Stop by Nat Cassidy. So this is about a guy who's travelling. He's a musician. He's on like a tour, and he stops at this gas station in the middle of nowhere and goes into the restroom and gets stuck in the restroom. And whilst he's in there, weird, horrible stuff starts happening in the gas station outside of the restroom. So this is just a fantastic suspense story. It ends up being like very graphic at times as well, but it's really that sense of unsettling suspense that grips you by the throat right from the start of the book and carries you through it. It's really, really well done. And Nat Cassidy is someone who manages to, despite writing like really compelling, propulsive, like thrilling horror fiction, also manages to make you think a bit as well. And he definitely does that in Rest Stop. It has a lovely epilogue at the end that kind of ties some of the themes of the book together beautifully. So a really interesting book from a really great new horror writer, which I definitely recommend. So there you have it then, 10 great works of horror from the last 10 decades. Hopefully, I think I've got quite a nice bit of variety in there. There's a few different styles of horror, definitely. But do let me know if you've got any recommendations from any of the last 10 decades to share with other people in the comments. People who may be looking for, for suggestions for Horror Mayhem. Do let me know what you think of my list. Hope you enjoyed it. And as always, thanks very much for watching. Hope you're safe and well out there. Hope you're reading good stuff. And I'll speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.